This isn't about whether Copilot works. It does. This is about what it quietly dissolves. We can measure acceleration. We have dashboards for it. We celebrate it in release notes. Architectural erosion is different. It doesn't show up as an error. It shows up when controls still exist, but stop meaning what we think they mean. Today, we'll talk about Dynamics 365 Copilot not as a feature or productivity boost, but as a force acting on enterprise architecture, calmly, clinically, without hype. Because erosion doesn't announce itself. It waits until the audit, the incident, or the headline. Framing the conversation. Let's be clear about what this episode is not. This is not a rant. This is not fear selling. And it isn't a dismissal of Microsoft's engineering capability. Microsoft has built something impressive. Copilot accelerates work, it reduces friction, but acceleration is not a neutral force. In physics, sustained force doesn't just create motion, it creates stress. When you increase throughput in a system, you also increase the load on its joints, the places where policy meets behavior, where documentation meets workflow, where controls meet the reality of execution. In organizations, that stress appears as architectural erosion. Not failure, erosion. The controls are still there. The dashboards light up green. But the behavior that once conformed to those controls no longer does. So the question isn't, does Copilot help people move faster? The question is, what assumptions does it quietly invalidate while it does? Most organizations treat Copilot like a tool that lives inside a single app surface. Architecturally, it's something else, a distributed decision engine that composes actions across Dynamics, Graph, Power Automate, Outlook, and Teams. Your policies are written for discrete systems. Copilot operates across them. That distinction matters. Everything clicked when I stopped asking, is the user allowed to do this? And started asking, what composite identity actually executed this? Most enterprises don't have an answer. They have logs of effects, not lineage of causes. They have approvals, not knowledge. They have security models designed for humans acting locally, and they now run agents acting globally. The result isn't a breach or a misconfiguration. It's drift. It's the slow conversion of deterministic governance into a probabilistic one, conditional chaos with nice UI. If that sounds abstract, we'll ground it in the places where erosion hides. The decision points that used to be human, slow, and accountable. Finance approvals, credit risk overrides, procurement choices, customer concessions, these are the joints that carry load. This is where stress accumulates first. The 4 scenarios that quietly reshape control. Why these domains? Because business logic, compliance, and human accountability intersect here. You won't see erosion in a demo. You see it in finance month-end, in disputed receivables, in sourcing audits, in customer recovery budgets. Let's walk through 4 concrete Dynamics 365 cases and watch what stays the same and what becomes hollow. Invoice approval. On the surface, this looks harmless. Copilot summarizes invoices, highlights anomalies, recommends approval, and triggers a workflow. Same approval path, same audit record. But the human approver isn't evaluating raw data anymore. They're validating a compressed narrative. Fields were selected, weighted, and framed before the approver even saw them. The control still exists. The signature still happens. But the epistemic foundation, what the approver actually knows, has shifted. That isn't automation, it's mediation. Over time, approval quality correlates with narrative quality, not signal quality. You don't notice until variance tightens and outliers slip through. Credit hold release. Here the blast radius expands. Copilot evaluates history, payment trends, open disputes, and recommends overriding a credit hold. Historically, these exceptions were rare, deliberate, and heavily scrutinized. Now they arrive as contextual suggestions accepted with a click. Seasonality, partial histories, and dispute metadata collapse into a single confidence statement. The control didn't disappear, human friction did. That changed the baseline. The downstream impact touches revenue recognition, cash forecasting, and sales compensation. You'll see the change in your comp disputes before you see it in your risk model. Procurement vendor selection. Copilot compares vendors across opaque weightings and filtered sources, then surfaces preferred options. Afterward ask, which data sources mattered most? Which dimensions were overweighted? Which suppliers were filtered out for missing enrichment? The recommendation performs neutrality. The lineage is implicit. Policy intent, diversity targets, ESG factors, concentration caps turns into tool-mediated scoring. Reports show policy compliance, but supplier concentration risk increases. The misalignment isn't in the outcome, it's in the invisible weighting that produced it. Customer service case resolution. Copilot drafts responses, proposes refunds, suggests goodwill credits. Who made the decision? The agent, the model, the workflow designer, the policy author. Ownership diffuses. Escalation thresholds soften because more actions get resolved at lower levels with higher variance. Benevolence defaults emerge. Goodwill when unsure. Partial credits when confidence dips. Unmodeled edge cases quietly leak value. Repeat abuses, stacked concessions across channels, compounding credits with no unified view. Audit shows definitive event logs. Decision causality isn't there. You can see what happened, not why. In all 4, the control exists. Approvals recorded, workflows fired, audit trails intact. What's missing is lineage of inputs, weighting, and decision authorship. That's architectural erosion. The joints are still present. They're no longer carrying the load you think they are. Scenario 1. Invoice approval. When validation becomes mediation. Invoice approval controls were built for a simple model. A human looks at structured fields, applies thresholds and policy, and takes responsibility for the decision. Copilot changes none of those artifacts. The approver still approves, the workflow still routes, the audit still captures who, when, and what object. Architecturally, it changes the substrate the human stands on. Okay, so basically, the approver no longer inspects signal, they validate a story. Copilot ingests lines, vendors, terms, PO match status, receipt variances, tax treatments, and historical behavior. It extracts, highlights, ranks anomalies, and produces a narrative with a recommended action. That narrative is the new interface. Think of it like a view model for risk. Pre-selected fields, pre-weighted features, a compressed explanation. The human's job shifts from decision author to narrative validator. Here's the weird part. The control still fires, but the knowledge behind it becomes probabilistic. What the approver actually knows is bounded by what the narrative chose to show, which line variances were ignored as noise, which suppliers were de-emphasized because their enrichment was sparse, which three-way match exceptions were reframed as resolved because a confidence threshold tipped. You won't see that in the approval form. You'll see a clean recommendation with a confidence band and a button. In other words, validation becomes mediation. The system mediates between raw signal and human judgment, and in doing so it redefines what review means. Over time, approvals begin to correlate with narrative quality, not underlying data quality. If the summary is coherent and the anomalies look tidy, approval probability rises. If the language is cautious and the highlights feel messy, deferral rises, even when the raw signals are the same. That distinction matters. Let's make it concrete. An invoice arrives with a 2.9% variance on a high-volume SKU, a late receipt entry, and a supplier known for seasonal discounts. Copilot presents minor variance within historical tolerance, late receipt resolved, supplier discount pattern consistent, recommend approve. The approver faced with dozens of these accepts. A week later, the model version and retrieval context shift. The same statistical profile is narrated differently. Variance exceeds target on non-discounted period, receipt timing abnormal, flag for buyer review. Same data shape, different narrative, two different human decisions that both look like valid approval process. Now add scale. Month end. Hundreds of invoices. The human relief valve, I'll click into the lines if something feels off, is exercised less. The summarization layer becomes the control surface. Nobody violated policy. It just moved. You're no longer auditing whether the policy was applied to the data. You're auditing whether the narrative engine presented the right slice of data to which the policy was then applied. That's a different control altogether. What this actually means is your evidence becomes effect, not cause. ERP logs capture the approval event, the workflow hop, the user identity. They don't capture which fields were considered, which thresholds were soft, which alternate hypotheses were discarded. The decision lineage, feature weights, tool calls, retrieval sources, lives outside your audit system if it exists at all. When an outlier leaks through, you can replay the event. You cannot replay the reasoning. Here's what most people miss. Mediation changes incentives. Approvers optimize for queue clearance under plausible deniability. If the narrative says low risk and the UI says approve, resistance becomes the exception pathway. Over time, variance tightens toward whatever the narrative normalizes. Edge cases learn to look average. Everything clicked when I realized the test is simple. Take 10 approved invoices from the last close. For each, list the fields a human actually saw in the narrative, then list the fields required by your policy documentation. The gap between those lists is architectural erosion. If the narrative omitted fields your policy assumes are always reviewed, your control exists in name only. The system did not break your approval process. It made it efficient, and in doing so, it redefined what approval means without changing a single checkbox. Scenario 2, credit hold release. From deliberate exception to suggestible default. Credit holds were designed as a brake, not a steering wheel. Historically, an override meant you stopped the line, assembled context, and accepted responsibility for downstream exposure. Copilot doesn't remove that brake, it lubricates it. The override still requires a human click. The difference is how often the option presents itself and how benign it feels when it does. Okay, so basically, the system aggregates balance aging, dispute flags, promise to pay notes, order backlog, seasonality, and customer tiering. It produces a risk score with a suggested action, release, partial release, or maintain hold. The suggestion arrives in the place sales actually lives, on the opportunity in the order entry pane in the sidecar, framed as low risk to fulfill, with recent payments and sentiment highlights. The friction that once lived in data collection moves into a single plausible click. Here's the uncomfortable part. The exception becomes the baseline. Rare overrides were once social signals, sales and finance aligned on a bet with memory attached. Now the pattern looks like good customer, pattern consistent, recommend release. The override path becomes a suggestible default. The narrative organizes the ambiguity, and the click becomes routine. In other words, what used to be deliberation turns into acceptance of a model's confidence, but confidence compresses nuance. Seasonality matters. A 45-day slip in Q1 looks different than in Q4. Disputes matter. A billing error note created yesterday isn't the same as one aging at 58 days with partial credits pending. Partial histories matter. Acquired subsidiaries with fragmented ledgers can mask aggregate risk. The model will do its best, but its summary will collapse that texture into a score and a sentence. Over time, humans read the sentence, not the context. Let's make it concrete. A wholesale customer with a strong 24-month history hits a hold due to a cluster of 35 to 45-day invoices tied to a pricing dispute after a product transition. Copilot shows recent on-time payments, highlights a dispute note, and tags expected resolution by Friday. It recommends a partial release for the open order because pattern consistent, low incremental risk to fulfill. And sales accepts, the shipment leaves. Finance closes the dispute a week later at a 3% concession. Individually, this looks reasonable. Repeated across dozens of customers in a seasonal trough, and the cumulative exposure shifts your cash forecast by a week and your revenue recognition by a period. Your comp plan sees it first. Here's what most people miss: the narrative pre-sorts accountability. If the recommendation is release and the user clicks accept, who owns the exposure when the promise to pay fails? The rep who clicked? The model author who tuned the risk band? The workflow designer who surfaced the suggestion? In Audit, you'll see user accepted recommendation. In practice, the choice architecture created that acceptance. Friction migrated from human judgment to model tuning. Everything clicked when I realized the blast radius isn't just financial, it's semantic. Credit hold stops meaning stop until risk is resolved. It starts meaning pause until Copilot says it's fine. Policy intent moves from exception discipline to throughput optimization. That distinction matters. Now layer in non-determinism. Run the same customer pattern 2 weeks apart with a slightly different model snapshot or retrieval context. One run recommends maintain hold due to clustered disputes and aging. The next recommends partial release on positive payment momentum. 2 different human decisions, both logged as compliant. Testing and change validation break here because there is no stable decision function to replay. There is only a probabilistic posture under shifting context. And what this actually means is your control evidence becomes performative. You can prove that a human approved that policy text exists, that a score was calculated. You cannot reconstruct which features tipped the recommendation, which alternative actions were considered, or why seasonality was downweighted this week. You can't tell a regulator or your CFO why the override pattern changed in March. The test is straightforward. Pull the last 50 releases from hold. For each, answer 4 questions. Which disputes were active? What was the aging distribution? What features and weights drove the recommendation? Who explicitly accepted ownership for the exposure? If you can't answer the third and the fourth without spelunking across Dynamics, Automate, and Outlook, the hold control has already turned into a suggestible default. The system didn't remove your brake. It trained your drivers to tap it lightly and trust the dashboard. Scenario 3. Procurement vendor selection, the neutral recommendation that isn't. Procurement controls were built on the fiction that best value is a fixed function, documented inputs, transparent weights, auditable outputs. Copilot doesn't challenge that fiction. It performs it beautifully. It pulls historical PO performance, lead times, defect returns, SLA breaches, ESG flags, price curves, and contract terms. It produces a side-by-side. One option is preferred. The narrative is calm. The interface looks fair, and yet, architecturally, it is something else. Okay, so basically, you've replaced policy interpretation with tool-mediated scoring. The policy still exists, the report still cites it. But the recommendation pathway, data coverage, dimensional weighting, supplier filtering, now lives inside a reasoning layer you don't see. Think of it like an authorization compiler for choices. You provide intent, the system compiles it into feature weights and source selections, and you review the bytecode as a tidy comparison table. Here's the weird part. Neutrality is a performance. Data coverage is not uniform. Mid-tier vendors often have sparse enrichment, fewer third-party risk feeds, less consistent ASN telemetry, inconsistent ESG attestations. Sparse data looks risky to a model tuned to optimize confidence. But confidence is not the same as performance. The output reads lower risk, better on-time record. What it actually means is denser data, clearer telemetry. Over time, that becomes a structural bias for the already integrated supplier. In other words, selection drift happens without a villain. Weighting sneaks too. If your sourcing policy says price 40, quality 30, delivery 20, risk 10, what happens when the narrative promotes supplier stability into delivery and risk simultaneously? The weights now sum to 120 in practice, not 100 on paper. You don't notice because the table shows 4 columns and a friendly recommended. Concentration creeps. Your quarterly dashboard still hits diversity and ESG checkboxes because someone found one secondary vendor on small awards, but the blast radius of a primary disruption grew while reports stayed green. Let's make it concrete. A category manager is choosing between vendor A and vendor B for a critical subassembly. Vendor A is incumbent, deeply integrated with standard labels, EDI mappings, and quality metrics. Vendor B is cheaper by 3% with comparable defect rates in pilot runs, but thinner external risk coverage and newer ESG disclosures. Copilot's table highlights A's predictable lead times and lower supply chain risk footprint, footnoted to 3 external sources. It de-emphasizes B's price advantage behind a potential onboarding cost caveat sourced to historical category ramp-ups, none of which share this subassembly's geometry. The recommendation points to A. A month later, a demand spike hits. A performs as expected. The choice looks validated. Repeat that pattern across categories for a year, and you've trained the organization to equate coverage density with resilience and integration friction with risk. Your supplier mix calcifies. Here's what most people miss. Lineage is the control. If you can't say which sources were included, which were excluded, which weights were applied, and which transformations occurred before 2 vendors became comparable, you don't have a control, you have a ceremony. The audit will show you did a comparison. It won't show how the comparison defined reality. Everything clicked when I realized the neutral table hides 3 invisible filters. Data availability. Vendors with thin enrichment lose on risk, regardless of real-world performance. Dimensional coupling. Risk gets smuggled into delivery and quality, overweighting a single theme. Source selectivity. External feeds with inconsistent coverage become de facto policy. What this actually means is structural misalignment. Your sourcing policy intends diversification and long-term leverage. The tool-mediated scoring optimizes for short-term throughput and model certainty. That distinction matters. The test is blunt. Take 5 recent preferred awards. For each, reconstruct all sources consulted with coverage per supplier. The exact weights used, including any derived dimensions, the scoring before and after any normalization or onboarding cost adjustments, the identity of the person or system that authored those adjustments. If you cannot produce that in one place, the recommendation was not neutral. It was compiled, and the compiler owns your procurement posture more than your policy does. Scenario 4. Customer service case resolution. Ambiguous authority by design. Service controls were designed around a simple chain: intake, triage, disposition, escalation if thresholds trigger, with a named person accountable at each step. Copilot doesn't delete that chain, it overlays it quietly by drafting responses, proposing concessions, and suggesting goodwill when uncertainty is high. The artifacts stay the same, the case is updated, the refund posts, the SLA clock stops. Architecturally, something else happens. The locus of authority dissolves into a composite of agent, model, and workflow. Okay, so basically the human no longer originates action, they curate recommendations. Copilot ingests purchase history, defect codes, prior contacts, sentiment, warranty terms, social mentions, even channel risk. It drafts: apologize for inconvenience, offer 15% credit, ship replacement. The rep can edit, escalate, or accept. Acceptance becomes the norm because queue pressure rewards throughput. The decision is logged as the rep's. The authorship is shared by a model whose criteria you cannot see and a workflow designer you've never met. Here's the uncomfortable part. Benevolence defaults emerge. When confidence dips or policies conflict, the draft leans generous. Small refunds, expedited shipping, coupon stacks to restore trust. One-off, this looks humane. At scale, layered across channels, you create arbitrage surfaces. Repeat abusers learn patterns. Multi-channel stackers capture overlapping concessions. Edge cases, auto-resolved, accumulate into leakage you don't attribute to any single control. In other words, ambiguity is a feature. The system's helpfulness is optimized to end conversations quickly. That optimization is not the same as policy intent. Warranty terms become soft guidance. Fraud signals that live in another system become footnotes. Budget caps become suggestions with override approved by workflow when queue pressure spikes. The rep's click is the final mile of a path pre-paved by tuning you cannot reconstruct. Let's make it concrete. A customer reports a defective accessory outside warranty by 17 days, cites safety language in a blog, and complains on Twitter. Copilot assembles context, detects social heat, drafts an apology with a full refund and bonus credit to acknowledge inconvenience. The rep accepts. The case closes within SLA. A month later, finance notices arise in post-warranty concessions. Every case is within policy in the audit. The pattern isn't a violation. It's the emergent behavior of a recommendation engine tuned to prevent escalation, reinforced by dashboards that celebrate first contact resolution. Here's what most people miss. Escalation logic erodes from thresholds to narratives. Escalate when refund exceeds X is replaced by recommend goodwill when risk of churn is high, where churn risk is a black box that overweights recent sentiment and underweights lifetime value beyond the visible window. Supervisors see fewer escalations, not because risk decreased, but because the tool solved with concessions earlier. Quality review samples the tidy cases, not the ones that never escalated because the model rooted around friction. Everything clicked when I asked 3 blunt questions on a service floor. Which policy paragraph did this refund rely on? Which fraud features were considered and discarded? Who owns the concession budget after hours when the supervisor queue is overloaded? 3 different people gave 3 different answers. The rep pointed to the draft, the supervisor to a rule in a SharePoint, and the workflow owner to an automate flow with escape hatches. That is ambiguous authority by design. What this actually means is your evidence shows closure, not stewardship. You can prove that a customer got help quickly. You cannot prove that the concession ladder matched intent, that fraud signals were honored, or that budget guardrails held under load. Non-determinism compounds it. The same case pattern tomorrow might draft a partial refund with a stern tone because the model snapshot shifted or the channel vector changed. 2 different outcomes, both compliant on paper. The test is simple. Pull 50 auto-resolved concessions under a certain dollar threshold from last quarter. For each, reconstruct the policy clause cited, the fraud signals present at decision time, the recommended versus final amount, and the identity of the person or system that authorized variance. If you need to stitch Dynamics case notes, Outlook drafts, Teams chats, and automate runs to answer, authority is already ambiguous. The system didn't break your service process, it made it faster, and in doing so it converted accountability into a shared blur no audit can meaningfully assign. What architectural erosion looks like in practice. Let's move from storyline to system behavior. Not theory, mechanics. When Copilot acts as a distributed decision engine across Dynamics, Graph, Automate, Outlook, and Teams, 5 failure patterns show up consistently. They don't trigger red lights. They bend assumptions until controls keep existing while behavior stops matching intent. First, RBAC bypass by composition. You think in roles, duties, and privileges bound to a user in Dynamics. Agents don't respect that mental model. A single help me complete this action can traverse Dynamics data, call a Power Automate flow that invokes Graph to fetch messages, draft an email in Outlook, post in Teams, and write records back. Each hop is authorized in isolation. Together, they form a composite identity nobody designed or reviewed. No single role assignment is excessive. The orchestration is. Your authorization model is local. The agent pathway is global. That is not a violation. It's a side door created by integration where small, individually reasonable grounds accumulate into action authority you never intended to exist as a unit. Second, data lineage loss. After an agent-assisted decision, try to answer 3 blunt questions. Which tables and entities were actually consulted? Which fields influenced the outcome? And what transformations were applied before the recommendation appeared? You'll find logs of effects, workflow fired, email sent, record updated. You will not find cross-service, stitched causality, feature weights, tool calls, retrieval sources, and the order in which they informed judgment. Event logs are faithful to what happened. They are silent on why. That silence forces your auditors to certify ceremonies instead of decisions. It also means post-incident analysis becomes a fishing expedition across 5 systems, not a replay. Third, non-determinism embedded in deterministic workflows. The invoice approval workflow is deterministic. The narrative it now depends on is not. Run the same prompt on the same data under a slightly different model snapshot, retrieval window, or tool timeout, and you get a different recommendation with a different confidence band. Testing breaks, change validation breaks. You cannot freeze behavior without freezing the entire orchestration stack. Models, prompts, connectors, even time-bound grounding. That's not a bug. It is the nature of probabilistic reasoning threaded through deterministic rails, and it quietly invalidates regression testing strategies that assume stable decision functions. Fourth, blast radius growth. Agents are helpful precisely because they act in context and propagate helpfulness across surfaces. Close the loop, follow up, update the record, notify the team. That is convenience for the operator and an expansion for the system boundary. An assist that began as approve this invoice becomes updates to finance, a templated supplier email, a Teams message to the buyer, and a follow-up task. You didn't authorize that multi-surface cascade as a policy. You licensed it by enabling connectors and praising throughput. When behavior spans surfaces, incident scope grows from a record to a thread of side effects. Containment plans written for one app become insufficient for the chain. Fifth, accountability diffusion. When something drifts, who owns the decision? In the logs, a human clicked. In the reality, a model framed, a workflow offered, a designer configured, a policy text sat in SharePoint, and an agent stitched it together. Everyone influenced the outcome. Nobody authored it in a way that maps to your RATSI. Post factum, ownership collapses into the system. That feels safe until you need to remediate root causes. Where do you change the behavior, the prompt, the tool map, the weight, the connector? You will learn the answer only after 3 steering committee meetings and a week of hunting across run histories. Here's how these 5 combine in practice. A procurement analyst accepts a preferred supplier recommendation. The agent composes a tidy summary in Dynamics, adds onboarding steps via Automate, emails the vendor a template via Outlook, and posts a notification in Teams. A week later, a supply disruption hits. You try to reconstruct why preferred skewed that way. Audit says the analyst accepted a suggestion. Security says least privilege held. DLP says no exfiltration. Conditional access says the session was compliant. Every control is green, and yet the choice leaned toward the incumbent because data coverage was denser. That lineage is absent. The blast radius includes a purchase order, an email thread, and a project channel. You can see the effects. You cannot change the cause without guessing which layer to tweak. Everything clicked when I watched teams run tabletop exercises. Not what if the model is wrong, but what if the model is unexplainable. The answers were procedural, escalate, revert, roll back, until they hit orchestration reality. There is no rollback for a prompt string that lives in production, no revert for a connector weight changed last Tuesday, no single place where Y is captured. That is architectural erosion as a lived experience. Controls exist. Outcomes deviate from their intent in ways the controls were never designed to express, observe, or correct. Controls you believe you have and where they fray. Let's benchmark the comfort blankets. The policies you point to in board decks, the ones auditors sample and bless, they still exist. They just don't constrain what you think they do once Copilot operates as a distributed decision engine. Start with data loss prevention. DLP is boundary-centric. It watches for payloads crossing egress lines. Agents do something subtly different. They recombine data inside the boundary into outputs your policies never conceived as exfiltration. A narrative that blends payment terms, dispute notes, sentiment snippets, and supplier variance history isn't a copy of any one dataset. It's a synthesis that can reconstruct the very signals DLP was supposed to keep compartmentalized. No rule fires. Yet sensitive conclusions leave the system through email drafts, Teams posts, or API calls the agent triggered. You didn't leak data, you leaked meaning. DLP wasn't violated, it was outflanked. Conditional access next. Conditional access answers who got in, under what conditions. Useful, but orthogonal to agent behavior. The decision chain that matters spans post-sign-in actions, tool calls, connector hops, downstream automations. Sessions remain compliant while agents continue acting as context shifts, new device posture, new network path, new risk signal. Conditional access evaluates an event, agents express a process. By the time your condition would have blocked a human, the agent already queued emails, posted messages, and wrote records back. Your session control is a front door light in a facility with internal monorails. Least privilege feels like a bedrock. For humans, it can be. For agents, it's a composition problem. Each connector is reasonably permissioned. Each app has a narrow scope. Together, the orchestration becomes functionally overprivileged. No one granted that power explicitly. It emerged. A dynamics read here, a graph fetch there, a power automate runners with a service principal that can write just this table, and suddenly a narrative can trigger an end-to-end state change your RBAC diagram never modeled as a single unit. You pass every entitlement review and still enable composite authority, no control owner ever intended to exist in one-click path. Application lifecycle management and change are where most teams flinch when they see the reality. You treat prompts, tool maps, and grounding sources like configuration. They are logic. When they change, production behavior changes. Without gates, without rollbacks, without diffs you can explain to a cab. A new model snapshot, a reordered grounding source, a prompt edit to tighten risk language, and your invoice narratives shift tone, tipping human decisions in aggregate. ALM artifacts don't capture this because your pipeline doesn't know its code. You're mutating production decision functions live and calling it configuration hygiene. Segregation of duties is the paper shield that looks strongest and fails quietest. On paper, roles are separated. In behavior, agents observe, recommend, and execute across those roles under the banner of assistance. The analyst reviews the recommendation. The same persona accepts a templated outreach. The flow executes the transaction. No single actor violated SOD. The path did. The observation that used to be a distinct person is now a feature weight. The recommendation that used to be a meeting is now a sidecar suggestion. The execution that used to require a separate session is now a connected tool. Your SOD matrix is accurate, it's also inert. There are other seams. Information barriers assume static channels. Agents thread across channels to keep stakeholders informed, washing barriers with good intentions. Retention policies assume documents. Agents synthesize ephemeral outputs that live in chats and drafts, then regenerate on demand, evading retention by never being a canonical artifact. Incident response assumes a system boundary. Agents widen that boundary with every helpful cross-app nudge, multiplying scope while your runbook still expects a single application to isolate. Here's the pattern. Controls that bind events struggle against processes. Controls that assume locality falter under composition. Controls that enforce syntax crumble under semantics. And in every case, the agent doesn't break the rule. It roots around it with cooperative components you enabled. So what survives? Intent enforced as design, not as paper. Least privilege that models composite pathways, not isolated grounds. DLP that understands synthesis, not just strings. Conditional access that ties to step up on sensitive tool invocation, not merely login. ALM that treats prompts, connectors, and model selections as code with gates, rollbacks, and impact diffs. SOD that enforces separation across observe, recommend, execute, not just who clicked submit. If that sounds like new work, it is. The alternative is pretending these controls still carry the same load while dashboards stay green. They don't. In this architecture, green means no single event broke a rule. It does not mean the system behaved as intended. You don't need to rebuild the enterprise tomorrow. You need to stop misreading the gauges. Treat Copilot as a control plane participant, not an in-app helper. Track the chain, not the click. Govern the compiler, not the bytecode. When you do, the controls you believe you have start to matter again. Until then, they'll keep existing, while their meaning erodes under the weight you didn't know you'd put on them. The dynamics, MCP mechanics that enable conditional chaos. Most teams still picture Copilot as a chat feature inside Dynamics. Architecturally, it is something else, a distributed decision engine that compiles intent into multi-system action. The compiler here is Copilot Studio's orchestration layer, and the ABI to your ERP is the Model Context Protocol, MCP. Put simply, MCP exposes tools and view models. Copilot chooses and sequences them. Your environment executes them with your entitlements. That's the pathway where meaning erodes. Okay, so basically MCP is a standard broker. It presents a catalog of tools, find form, open form, read field, click button, execute operation, plus an exposed view model for each surface, which is the security scoped metadata of what the user would see: fields, actions, labels, state. When the agent receives a request, it doesn't run X++ logic directly. It asks the MCP server for the current view model snapshot, reasons on the available actions, then calls tools in order to accomplish the goal. Every call is legitimate. The chain, however, is emergent. Here's the weird part. 20 generic tool primitives unlock hundreds of thousands of operations. The May to November Microsoft previews moved from dozens of hard-coded actions to a human-like toolset. Navigate, select, set, submit, wrapped around a server-side computer use model. No client session spins up. The agent consumes server-rendered view models, then issues actions the way a human would. That makes security review happy. No secret backdoor. It also means your control surface is now everything a human could do, sequenced faster than a human would, across features a human wouldn't remember. In other words, deterministic business logic hasn't gone away. It's been wrapped by stochastic orchestration. Your depreciation calculation remains precise. The path that reaches it is probabilistic. Which form the agent opens first, which field it reads to infer context, which action it tries and retries, which connector it calls when it needs data outside the module. Non-determinism enters at the orchestration layer: tool choice, order, timeout handling, model selection, which then drives deterministic functions underneath. That distinction matters, because testing the function no longer proves the behavior. Think of the orchestration like an authorization compiler. You state intent, assess risk and release hold, and a planner decomposes it into steps that each satisfy local permissions. The composite pathway was never authorized explicitly as one thing, yet it exists. Because MCP keeps the view model bounded by role, duty, and privilege, everyone relaxes. It can only see what a user can see. True, but the agent's memory and speed turn can see into will traverse and may click into will click in sequence. View model exposure is the pivot. Every field the human could inspect becomes a token for reasoning. Every enabled button becomes a candidate action. The model doesn't understand your policy intent, it understands affordances. Affordances are deceivingly neutral. Button present looks harmless. Until you realize that button chains now compose across pages and processes without human cognition as the bottleneck. The affordance graph is your new control surface. Now add human-like tool semantics. Open list, filter by label, select first row with matching text, click command. These are robust against UI changes and broad enough to cover edge forms you forgot existed. They're also noisy. The agent makes attempts, observes results, and adjusts. That adaptivity is a feature. It's also where non-determinism enters your deterministic rails. Different runs converge on different locally valid pathways. Computer use without a client is the other enabler. Because snapshots are server-rendered, there's no difference between what the user sees and what the agent reasons over. It's all metadata and state. That eliminates a whole class of screen scrape fragility and makes the agent confident in navigating. It also hides lineage in a place your audit doesn't collect, the dialogue between planner and MCP about which actions were considered and rejected. You'll see the final tool calls. You won't see the discarded branches that shape the recommendation. Deterministic cores wrapped in probabilistic loops create conditional chaos, not because the system is broken, but because the order, timing, and retrieve influence outcomes at scale. A slow response from an analytics server changes which feature wins a tiebreak in the planner. A model upgrade weights recent payments slightly higher than aging distribution. A connector transient nudges the agent to fall back to a different data source this time. Every step is justified. The net effect is drift. Everything clicked when I mapped the mechanics to controls. The MCP guarantees the view model is security bounded. It does not guarantee lineage. The tool catalog guarantees actions are legitimate. It does not guarantee separation across observe, recommend, execute. Orchestration guarantees productivity. It does not guarantee reproducibility. When you realize that, you stop treating Copilot like an in-app helper and start treating it like a control plane participant that compiles your intent into action graphs you don't see. The mitigation isn't to block MCP. It's to encode intent at the orchestration edge. Require decision traces, inputs, tool sequences, feature weights alongside outcomes, gate-sensitive tool invocation behind step-up, and treat prompts, tool maps, and model choices as code with ALM parity. Enforce your assumptions at the boundary where stochastic planning meets deterministic ERP. Otherwise, you'll keep certifying green dashboards while the compiler quietly refactors what your controls mean. The governance model you're actually running. Most organizations still describe their environment as if they're operating an identity provider with apps at the edge and humans in the loop. They are not. Architecturally, you are running a distributed decision engine where Entra, Dynamics, Copilot Studio, Power Automate, Graph, Outlook, and Teams collaborate to compile intent into action graphs. That distinction matters because your governance model isn't the one written in your policies. It's the one expressed by the system's actual behavior. Start with identity. You think authentication plus RBAC. In reality, it's identity as orchestration, human session tokens, run as service principles, connector secrets, and implicit scopes stitched by agents at runtime. Entra sits at the center, but what leaves Entra is not a stable subject acting in one application. It's a subject that multiplies into a composite pathway across tools. You are no longer granting access to apps. You're granting permission to assemble action graphs. Now look at the control plane. Copilot Studio is not a chat designer. It's an implicit compiler of policy and prompts. You describe guardrails and goals in natural language, attach tool maps, select models, and connect data. The orchestrator translates that into plans the agent executes. Every helpful change, a prompt tweak, a new grounding source, a reordered tool preference, alters production decision functions. If you treat these like configuration, you get configuration hygiene. If you treat them like code, you get governance. Most teams do the former. Exceptions are your entropy generators. Every, except for this one urgent scenario, each temporarily allow this connector. Every run as account with broader scope to unblock the team expands the probabilistic surface. Deterministic rules degrade into probabilistic behaviors through accreted allowances you never rolled back. Over time, the exception path becomes the default. You didn't change policy. You diluted it through convenience. Drift mechanics do the rest. Prompts evolve. Tool catalogs grow. Agent roles multiply. None of this has ALM parity with your deterministic systems. There's no standard diff for tone tightened, risk emphasis increased. There's no rollback semantics for re-ranked grounding sources. There's no impact analysis for added supplier enrichment feed with sparse coverage. The result is live mutation of production behavior without gates. Drift isn't a failure to document, it's the inevitable outcome of governing stochastic logic with static processes. Because you cannot guarantee determinism at the orchestration edge, you operationalize unpredictability through human smoothing. This is the hidden policy, acceptable failures. If it looks odd, the analyst tweaks it. If it escalates, the supervisor fixes it. If a refund feels off, the rep adjusts the amount. You wrap non-determinism in human discretion and call it resilience. It works until volume rises, people change, or incentives shift. Then the smoothing layer becomes a randomizer with a smile. Ownership follows. Racy models assume clear, named owners for steps. In the orchestration reality, authorship diffuses. Model selection by a platform admin, prompt by a designer, connector scopes by an integration owner, tool sequencing by the planner, and a human click at the end. Post-incident, everyone influenced the outcome. Nobody authored it in a way you can change without touching 4 teams. Your governance is a federation of good intentions tied together by a control plane you do not treat as such. Here's the uncomfortable truth. What you believe you're running, identity provider plus app controls, isn't strong enough to express the system you actually run. The working governance looks like this. Identity as composition. The effective actor is a chain, not a user. Policy as compilation. Intent is transformed into plans by orchestration, not enforced directly. Exceptions as entropy. Every allowance increases the probabilistic surface. Drift as default, logic mutates without ALM parity or rollback. Acceptable failures as process, human smooth unpredictability, ad hoc. Accountability as diffusion, many hands, no author. What survives in that landscape are the controls you can encode where stochastic planning meets deterministic course. Enforce step-up at sensitive tool invocation, not just at sign-in. Require decision traces, inputs, sources, tool sequences, and feature influences attached to outcomes. Treat prompts, tool maps, model choices, and connector scopes as code with gates, reviews, and rollbacks. Model composite pathways in access reviews, not isolated grants. And define SOD across observe, recommend, execute, not just who clicked submit. You are already running a control plane. If you don't govern it as such, it will continue to compile your written intent into behaviors your written controls can't explain. That is the governance model you're actually running, until you design a better one. Audit without causality. Why what happened isn't why it happened. Auditors keep asking the right question with the wrong instruments. They ask what happened. The systems answer flawlessly who clicked, which record, which timestamp, which workflow hop. But in a distributed decision engine, what is not why. Causality lives in the orchestration layer, feature weights, tool sequences, retrieval choices, and discarded branches, not in the ERP event log. Mechanically, your logs are faithful to effects. Dynamics records the approval, the field change, the entity update. Power Automate records the run, the connector call, the success code. Outlook logs the draft sent. Teams logs the post. Each service is a perfect historian of its own actions. None of them capture the decision chain that led to those actions, the inputs evaluated, the alternatives considered, the thresholds that tipped, or the reason one pathway was taken over another. You have chronology without causality. Okay, so basically, you're auditing bytecode without the compiler trace. The compiler here is Copilot Studio's planner working through MCP. It decides which view model to request, which fields to read, which tool to call, in what order with what backoffs. It weighs features, blends sources, and prunes branches. That dialogue is where why lives. You don't collect it, so you reconstruct intent after the fact by stitching effects across 5 systems and calling the resulting timeline an explanation. It isn't. Here's the uncomfortable part. Reproducibility is your surrogate for causality, and non-determinism breaks it. If you can replay the inputs and get the same outcome, you feel justified that the decision was sound. But reasoning models are probabilistic. Model snapshots shift. Retrieval windows roll. Connector latencies change order of evidence. Identical prompts produce adjacent, sometimes divergent, recommendations. Your replay passes because you got an answer, not the answer. Causality remains unknown. In other words, current evidence answers who performed the terminal action, not who authored the decision. Your RASI points to the human click, because that's the only stable identity in the chain, but authorship is distributed. The prompt the designer edited last week, the tool map that reordered a connector fallback yesterday, the planner that weighted recent payments a touch higher than aging this morning. The click executed, the plan decided. Let's make it concrete. Pull an override from last month. Your audit shows user A released hold at 10:42, automate flow B ran successfully, Outlook mailed confirmation, teams informed the account team. Tight, legible, compliant. Now ask, which disputes were present and which were downweighted, which enrichment feeds were missing, so risk defaulted to unknown, which confidence threshold tipped the recommendation from maintain to partial release, and which fallback source supplied the tie-breaking signal after a transient timeout. You won't find those answers in one place. You'll find effects and infer causes. Here's what most people miss. Explainability isn't a narrative paragraph attached to a record. It's an artifact that binds inputs to outcome via the selections the planner made. Without a decision trace, the inputs ingested, sources consulted, feature influences, tool calls in order, and branches pruned, you cannot distinguish a sound judgment from a satisfying shortcut that happened to pass. You can certify ceremony, you cannot certify reasoning. What this actually means is your compliance stance overfits to the observable. You collect what your systems emit because that's what exists. Regulators accept it because it's consistent. Meanwhile, the locus of risk has moved to a layer that emits nothing you retain. The audit answers what happened with increasing precision as why it happened, drifts further into guesswork and institutional memory. Everything clicked when I watched an incident review try to answer a basic variance question. Why did March approval skew lenient? The room pulled exports, tallied clicks, compared model versions, and argued about seasonality. Nobody could show the causal graph of decisions. Not the list of features that mattered more this month than last. Not the tool fallbacks that silently changed evidence order. Not the confidence threshold that moved from 0.74 to 0.71. The team produced a professional-looking narrative. It wasn't causality, it was storytelling with timestamps. So what's the fix? Require decision traces at the orchestration edge. Treat them like first-class artifacts. Capture the inputs the agent saw, tables, fields, external feeds, the feature influences or scores, the order tool sequence with parameters, the branches considered and pruned, the model snapshot identifier, and the prompt/version hashes. Bind that trace to the outcome record. Now your what points to a why you can inspect, replay, and challenge. Add a second guard. Step up on sensitive tool invocation. If the plan touches high-impact actions, release hold, issue refund beyond threshold, reassign supplier, demand human affirmation with the trace visible. Make acceptance explicit. I reviewed inputs and influences. This doesn't slow the world. It localizes accountability to the authorship moment, not the terminal click. Finally, put orchestration artifacts under ALM. Prompts, tool maps, model choices, connector scopes, version them, gate them, diff them, roll them back. Without that, your decision traces will show drift you can't control. Auditors can keep certifying effects, or you can give them causes. Without causality, green dashboards mean you know how to log. They do not mean you know how the system decided. The one test every admin should run next week. Pick one Copilot influence decision that actually shipped value. Not a demo, a production action with dollars attached. An approved invoice, a released credit hold, a preferred supplier award, or a goodwill refund. Give it a ticket number. That's your specimen. Reconstruct the inputs, not all dynamics data. Enumerate tables and fields the agent likely touched. For finance, vend invoice jur, vend trans, ledger trans, purge line, invent trans, bank payment ledger. Fields like amount cur, cash disk, delivery date, three-way match status, aging bucket. For credit, cust trans, cust aging snapshot, cust table, case entity for disputes. Fields like days past due, dispute reason, promise to pay date, credit max. For procurement, vend table, purge RFQ line, quality measures, external risk feeds if you have them. For service, case interaction history, warranty terms, fraud signals. Write the list before you query anything. Now enumerate identities and scopes. Who was the human? Which service principals ran the flows? Which connectors executed with run as? Capture Entra object IDs, app registrations, consented permissions. Map each hop, dynamics, automate, graph, Outlook, Teams. If you can't produce the runners chain and scopes for each hop, stop. Your RBAC picture is already local, not composite. Trace services crossed. Pull the power automate flow runs linked to that record's timeline. List connectors invoked with timestamps and return codes. Query graph audit logs for message drafts or sends tied to the same correlation window. Extract Teams message posts that reference the entity ID. Align them on a single timeline. If overlap exists without a shared correlation ID, note it. That's a blast radius with no single thread. Attempt Lineage. For the specimen, answer 4 causality questions. Which inputs were read? Which features were decisive? Which tool sequence executed? Which branches were pruned? Practically, you'll gather dynamics audit entries, effect, automate run history, effect, Outlook, Teams logs, effect, and maybe model prompt version notes if you keep them, likely missing. Document the gaps explicitly. We know what happened here, here, and here. We do not know why the plan chose X over Y. Run the reproducibility check, freeze data snapshots where possible, reissue the same prompt or action in a non-production clone with the current model and grounding. Note divergences in recommendation text, confidence bands, or tool order. If behavior shifts materially, circle it. That's non-determinism inside a deterministic control. Score the test. Use 5 flags: composite identity unknown, lineage absent, non-deterministic behavior, unbounded blast radius, accountability diffused. If you raise 2 or more on one specimen, you don't have a bad record, you have a systemic property. Close with 1 corrective action per flag. Examples: for composite identity unknown, require per hop runner's disclosure in flow design and attach it to the outcome record. For lineage absent, mandate decision traces, inputs, feature influences, tool sequence bound to the artifact. For non-determinism, pin model prompt versions for regulated workflows and add evaluation gates. For blast radius, gate cross-service actions behind step-up and correlation IDs. For accountability diffused, require an authorship acknowledgement, add acceptance with trace visibility. Run the same test monthly. Trend the flags. If green dashboards disagree with your trend, trust the test. Intent enforcement, mitigations that actually work at scale. Most teams try to paper over erosion with policy PDFs and training decks. It doesn't work. You don't recover intent with more words. You recover it by encoding assumptions at the exact boundary where stochastic planning meets deterministic cause. Treat Copilot as a control plane participant and enforce your design there. First, invert trust. Agents don't get the ENV, they earn it. Default deny cross-service orchestration. Constrain the tool catalog, not the user. Limit MCP to the minimum view models and actions a given flow actually needs. For automate, kill the use my connection anti-pattern. Require explicit runners identities per connector per flow with scopes pinned to a single business capability. Make new connector a change that requires review by a control owner, not an enthusiastic maker. The safe posture is it does too little until we're certain, not it can do everything until something breaks. Second, force lineage. Decisions without traces are ceremonies. Require agents to emit a decision trace alongside outcomes. Inputs consulted, tables, fields, external feeds, feature influences or scores, ordered tool sequence with parameters, branches considered and pruned, model snapshot and prompt hashes. Bind that trace to the ERP artifact as a first-class attachment and log the correlation ID across Automate, Outlook, and Teams. Lineage isn't a convenience for audit, it's your only path to causality when behavior drifts under probabilistic orchestration. Third, determinize boundaries. You won't make the planner deterministic, but you can freeze its envelope where regulation demands it. Pin model versions for regulated workflows, version prompts and tool maps as code. Define an evaluation gate. Before a prompt or grounding change goes live, run a regression suite. Seeded specimens that must produce equivalent recommendations within a tolerance band. Fail the gate if variance breaches policy. This doesn't halt innovation, it channels it through a safety choke point. Fourth, compile decisions. Don't rely on good prompts. Encode guardrails as pre-validated action graphs. Build a policy-to-code layer that matches intents like release hold over X if A, B, C to a finite approved tool sequence with explicit inputs and step-up checkpoints. Let the planner propose, but require the compiler to accept only sequences that match a known safe pattern or escalate for human review. Think of it as a macro firewall. Valid macros pass, unknown macros require inspection. Fifth, ALM parity for the agent surface. Treat prompts, tool maps, model selections, connector scopes, and grounding sources as code. They get branches, reviews, tests, gates, and rollbacks. Diff prompts like diffs matter because they do. Track impact. This connector re-ranking changed risk narratives in the last sprint by X%. Publish a changelog to control owners, not just the maker community. If you can't roll back a prompt in production, you're running logic without safety. Sixth, human out-of-loop tests. If your safety depends on human smoothing, measure what happens when humans don't intervene. Run synthetic scenarios end-to-end in a non-production tenant with queue pressure simulated and escalation throttled. Score leakage, concession drift, and SOD breaches expressed as observe, recommend, execute collisions. Set budgets, acceptable variance bands, acceptable false positive rates, acceptable refund ladders. If the agent exceeds them without human correction, it's not ready for assist in production. Seventh, step up where it matters. Conditional access at sign-in is table stakes. Require step up on sensitive tool invocation, release hold, issue refunds above threshold, change supplier status, modify risk bands. Present the decision trace at the moment of acceptance and require an authorship acknowledgement. I reviewed inputs and influences. Tie that acknowledgement to a named person and role, not the catch-all system account. Ownership sits at the authorship moment, not the terminal click. Eighth, composite pathway reviews. Access reviews that list user entitlements miscomposition. Build a quarterly exercise that enumerates actual agent pathways observed. Dynamics, Automate, Graph, Outlook, Teams. For each, show the runner's chain scopes and side effects. Retire unused connectors. Narrow runners principles. Add step up where side effects exceeded policy intent. Review pathways, not roles. Ninth, synthesis-aware DLP. Traditional DLP hunts strings. You need policies that detect synthesized meanings. Classify outputs that combine sensitive attributes, payment terms with dispute notes and aging, leaving through email drafts or Teams posts. Gate dispatch behind review or redact sensitive features in narratives by default. You're not blocking exfiltration, you're containing inadvertent inference. 10th, SOD re-expressed as phases. Enforce separation across observe, recommend, execute. An agent may observe and propose, a different persona approves, a third executes, even if execution is automated. Encode this in tool availability and MCP scopes, not just in your RASI chart. If one identity can pull all three without step-up, your SOD is ceremonial. Finally, operationalize drift. Expect it, don't fear it. Run continuous evaluation harnesses on live traffic samples. Alert on narrative polarity shifts, sudden changes in recommend rates, concession ladders, supplier preference. Tie alerts to the orchestrator changelog. Risk prompt updated, grounding source re-ranked, model snapshot advanced. Close the loop quickly, roll back first, investigate next. None of this reads like a poster, it reads like engineering. That's the point. Intent enforced as design survives contact with probabilistic planning. Intent declared as policy erodes the moment you add acceleration. Executive translation, acceleration with debt you can't see. Executives measure acceleration, cycle times, close rates, backlog burn, case deflection. Those numbers will improve. They should. The uncomfortable truth is you'll also accumulate debt that doesn't manifest as red. It hides in three places: variance you don't price, blast radius you don't bound, and explainability gaps you don't track. Start with variance. Your dashboards show medians. The system you're actually running is probabilistic. That means the tails move. Approvals that used to cluster near a stable decision function now widen with model posture, retrieval windows, and connector timing. You won't see it in weekly deltas. You'll feel it in quarter close when a handful of borderline decisions swung lenient and cash landed 5 business days later. Your revenue line is still correct. Your working capital is jittery. Finance absorbs it first. Sales comp accrues it next. Next, blast radius. A helpful recommendation rarely stops at a screen. It propagates, email drafted, teams notified, tasks scheduled, tables updated. Multiply that across agents and surfaces, and your incident scope grows from a bad call to a threaded series of small, reasonable actions now embedded in 3 systems. Containment takes longer. Root cause analysis crosses org charts. You didn't expand risk appetite, integration did. Explainability is the third gap. Auditors won't ask, was this fast? They'll ask, why did this direction change in March? Without decision traces, you answer with exports and a story. That works until it doesn't. The first time a regulator asks for causal evidence or a board committee asks for feature-level drivers behind a spike, you'll learn the difference between certified effects and explainable decisions. Your current evidence model is blind to that distinction. Translate that into numbers. Risk variance shows up as forecast error bands widening by days, not hours. Run a backtest on the last 6 months, volatility of days sales outstanding before versus after, assist adoption. If the standard deviation grew while medians improved, you moved risk from average to tail. Security, composite identity isn't a breach, it's a surface. Count cross-service action graphs per decision, not app sign-ins. If the average hops per decision increased, your exposure grew even as sessions stayed compliant. Compliance, time to explain, becomes a metric. Take a specimen incident and clock how long it takes to produce inputs, influences, and tool sequence. If explanation time exceeds change time by an order of magnitude, you're carrying audit debt. Now quantify the cost curve. Speed now is real. Headcount avoidance, faster quote to cash, lower handle time. The bill later isn't theoretical, it's compounded operational drag when you can't localize behavior change. Every ambiguous outcome costs 3 meetings in a week of hunting. Every cross-surface incident consumes 2 extra teams. Every audit cycle pulls senior architects away from delivery to reconstruct why with screenshots. None of those show up in ROI models until they do all at once. So what do you buy with a little friction up front? Survivability, small deliberate slowdowns, step up on sensitive actions, decision traces attached to outcomes, gates for prompt and tool map changes, trade a 2% throughput tax for a 90% reduction in where did this behavior come from? Firefights, pre-baked pathways for high-impact actions cap blast radius, versioned prompts and pinned models in regulated flows cap variance. Those aren't platform problems, they're executive choices. Set tolerances like you do in operations. Define acceptable decision variance bands by domain. Credit releases within these risk bands should deviate less than X% week over week. Define maximum composite hops for high-risk actions, no more than N cross-service steps without step-up. Define time to explain budgets. Seam to explanation under T hours for P1 finance decisions. Those are KPIs your teams can engineer toward. Without them, they'll optimize the only metric they see, throughput. Finally, ask for one artifact you don't have today, a quarterly orchestration changelog, not model hype, a ledger of prompts, tool maps, model versions, connector scopes, and grounding re-rankings that affected production decisions with measured impact. If you can't get it, you're financing speed with invisible debt. If you can, you've turned erosion into something you can see, price, and govern. That's the trade. Faster, yes. And understandable, containable, and defensible when, not if, you're asked why. What to remember before the next agent pilot. If you remember nothing else, remember these 5 constraints. They are not opinions. They are properties of the system you are already operating. If you can't enforce your intent in code, you won't enforce it in production. Policy PDFs don't intercept action graphs. Prompts, tool maps, model choices, connector scopes, these are code. They change outcomes. Give them ALM parity, or accept silent mutation as your operating model. The team that owns policy must own the compiler guardrails, not just the SharePoint page. If you can't reproduce a decision, you can't defend it. Probabilistic planners will drift. That is fine if you freeze the envelope. Pin model versions for regulated flows. Version and gate prompts require decision traces, inputs, feature influences, tool sequence, pruned branches, bound to outcomes. Reproducibility isn't getting an answer twice, it's explaining why this answer followed from these inputs under this plan. If your logs don't capture causality, you don't have accountability. Event logs certify effects, they don't show authorship. Capture the orchestration layer's choices at the moment they're made, not after the click. Then move approval to where authorship lives. Step up on sensitive tool invocation with the trace visible and an explicit acknowledgement. I reviewed inputs and influences beats user clicked submit when auditors ask why. If your exceptions grow, your system becomes probabilistic by default. Every temporary allowance expands the surface. Track exceptions as entropy, count them, age them, burn them down. Treat temporary as a budgeted risk with an expiry, not a lifestyle. When you feel urgency, add step up, not scope. You cannot velocity your way out of erosion seeded by convenience. If your control model is paper, your architecture will ignore it. Model composite pathways and access reviews, re-express SOD across observe, recommend, execute, encode, synthesis aware DLP, demand ALM for the agent surface. When intent is design, controls survive contact with acceleration. When intent is prose, orchestration compiles around it. Translate those constraints into 3 operating habits before you approve the next pilot. Define tolerances, decision variance bands, maximum composite hops, time to explain budgets. If teams don't know the bounds, they'll optimize throughput and call it success. Install gates. Regression suites for prompt and grounding changes. Step up on high-impact tool chains, pre-validated macro patterns for risky actions. Gates cost little compared to post-incident archaeology. Publish a changelog, quarterly, for the orchestrator surface. Prompts, tool maps, model snapshots, connector scopes, grounding re-rankings with measured impact. If you can't see the mutations, you can't manage the drift. Finally, run the test. 1 specimen decision, end-to-end. Score composite identity unknown, lineage absent, non-determinism, unbounded blast radius, accountability diffused. 2 flags or more is not a bad day, it's your baseline. Trend it. If the flags fall while your dashboards stay green, you are bending acceleration back toward intent. If the flags hold while the medians improve, you are financing speed with invisible debt. This is not extra work layered on top of a pilot. This is the pilot. If you can't wire tolerances, gates, traces, and changelogs into a small bounded use case, you won't do it at scale. Start where dollars move. Make causality a deliverable. Treat Copilot like a control plane participant. Then decide if faster still means better for your architecture. This wasn't an argument against Copilot. It was an argument against pretending acceleration leaves architecture untouched, because erosion doesn't announce itself. It waits quietly behind green dashboards until the audit, the incident, or the headline. If you only measure throughput, you'll miss the variance, the blast radius, and the causality gap that make governance real. Run the specimen test, demand decision traces, gate the compiler, not just the click. If you want more like this, subscribe. And if you need the checklist we covered, the links in the notes. Faster can be safer, only when intent is enforced by design. Appendix and deep dive. Invoice approvals first, but with real-world edges. Multi-currency introduces silent drift. The narrative looks consistent in the company currency while rounding obscures a threshold breach in the transaction currency. 3-way match exceptions complicated further. OCR uncertainty on receipts becomes a confidence-weighted summary that downplays mismatches because the model weights legibility higher than variance. In practice, the agent reads vend invoice jur and purge line, infers match status from 3-way match status and amount cur, then compresses multiple lines into a single variance within tolerance statement. That statement is not a lie. It is a mediation that hides a 2.7% variance on an item where policy tolerance is 2.5% because conversions and rounding swallowed the difference. Lineage that lists fields and per-line variances prevents this. Without it, the control exists, meaning dissolves. Now credit hold releases in scarcity and seasonality. Disputed receivables skew aging snapshots. The agent sees cust aging snapshot, days past due, promise to pay date, and flags improving trend. But open disputes in case entity down weight risk only if a valid disposition exists. Many firms leave disputes in pending limbo. The planner interprets pending as risk neutral, pushing the recommendation toward partial release. Add seasonality. December spikes look like momentum in recent payments. The model weights recency, not seasonality. A sales team chasing year-end targets nudges acceptance. The composite pathway is clean, and your cash posture softens for January when the wave recedes. Guardrail. Pin seasonal baselines and require a dispute disposition weight to be explicit in the trace. Procurement vendor selection isn't neutral recommendation. It's scoring reality against policy intent. Dimensional coverage matters. If vendor A has deep on-time and full history and vendor B's ESG metrics are sparsely populated, the agent's balanced summary tilts toward A because missing ESG becomes unknown, not negative. Weighting silently privileges data-rich incumbents. Supplier enrichment feeds with uneven coverage magnify the effect. Add risk-weighted SLAs. A project labeled critical in one system doesn't propagate to the agent's planner grounding, so lead time gets a higher weight than dual sourcing constraints. The narrative reads preferred based on historical performance, when the policy intent was reduce concentration risk for critical projects. Fix. Surface the weighting table and missingness penalties in the decision trace. Encode critical as a gating attribute that inverts weights. Customer service case resolution looks simple until refund caps, fraud signals, and goodwill budgets collide. Caps live in policy PDFs, fraud in a model score, goodwill in a quarterly budget by segment. The agent drafts a concession and cites high sentiment risk from interaction history, but misses that the customer has exceeded goodwill for the quarter because the budget table isn't exposed in the view model. Or fraud signals trigger a manual review label that the agent interprets as slower response, increase goodwill to compensate. You intended, do not refund until cleared. The recommendation is benevolent drift. Enforce step-up on refund ladders above cap and expose fraud states as hard constraints, not soft signals the planner weighs. Now, invoice variance with OCR and three-way match. It's common to see the agent correctly identify a mismatch but downrank it when the receipt OCR confidence is low, framing it as possibly clerical. The human accepts the narrative because the exception queue is long. Multiply that by a month, and variance systematically tips lenient when documentation quality is poor. That's not malice, it's model posture. Require per-line confidence bands in the trace and a policy that flips posture. Low confidence increases scrutiny, not lenience. Credit hold edge cases include partial payment plans. Promise to pay date exists, but payment plan adherence sits in a different module. The planner reads recent small payments and calls it trend improvement, while plan deviation is high. Seasonality again. A retailer with high November-December volumes normalizes late payments in January. If you don't pin seasonality profiles per segment and propagate them to grounding, you will release based on recency bias. Procurement weights with ESG. If ESG factors are policy critical, missing data cannot be neutral. Force the trace to show missingness penalties and require a human to acknowledge when a preferred supplier wins despite unknown ESG. Otherwise, the agent nudges you toward concentration under the veneer of performance. Service refunds with fraud signals. Fraud models often output scores with bands. The planner treats band midpoints differently by snapshot. A model upgrade shifts thresholds by 2 points. Concessions drift. Pin bands in regulated flows and require step-up when the planner crosses a band edge. For each, capture lineage, tables, fields, external feeds, weights, tool sequence, and constrain tool scopes to the minimum viable set. Then your preferred partial release, variance within tolerance, and goodwill credit become decisions you can both execute and defend. Control mapping checklist. Use this as a build sheet, not slogans. Controls you can encode where stochastic planning meets deterministic cores. DLP. Synthesis-aware rules. Define protected combinations, not just strings. Payment terms plus dispute notes plus aging plus sentiment. Inspect agent outputs at egress surfaces, Outlook drafts, Teams posts, automate HTTP. Gate send on redaction or reviewer step-up. Log a correlation ID tying narrative to input features. Conditional access, move beyond sign-in. Require step-up on sensitive tool invocation. Release hold, refund above cap, supplier status change. Bind device or risk posture to agent actions mid-session with continuous access evaluation. Deny connector creation in high-risk contexts. Least privilege, kill use my connection. Per connector run as principles, single-purpose scopes, and time-bound secrets. Quarterly composite pathway reviews. Enumerate observed chains, dynamics, automate, graph, Outlook teams, retire unused hops, narrow scopes, add step up where side effects exceed policy. Elm, treat prompts, tool maps, model selection, grounding as code, branches, tests, gates, rollbacks, regression suites, seeded with specimens, fail on variance outside tolerance, publish a changelog with measured impact deltas. SOD, encode phases. Observe, recommend, execute must map to distinct identities. Enforce via MCP scopes and tool availability. Require human acknowledgement at approval with decision trace visible. Information barriers. Scope agents to channels. Deny cross-team posts by default. Allow lists per business process with per post correlation IDs. Retention. Persist decision traces as first-class records. Include model prompt hashes and tool sequences. Configure retention on traces and agent outputs equally. Incident response. Correlate across services by default. Playbooks pivot on correlation IDs, not app boundaries. Pre-authorize isolation of connectors and step-up elevation throttles. If you can't wire these, the dashboard's green light means no single event broke a rule, not the system behaved as intended. MCP Dynamics Technical Notes for Architects. This is the part the platform brochures skip. If you're the architect who will be asked to defend behavior in an incident review, these are the mechanics you need to internalize before you sign off on an agent pilot. Start with the MCP servers. There are two you'll care about most in finance and operations, the ERP MCP server and the Analytics BPA MCP server. The ERP server exposes the human-like tool catalog and the server-rendered view model snapshots for operational forms. The analytics server exposes dimensional queries over business performance analytics for reasoning on aggregates. Treat them as different surfaces. The ERP server is for acting in the transaction world. The analytics server is for reading the world's shape. Do not blur them casually with a shared run as identity. That's how you turn read insights into act based on insights without a gate. Understand view model security. The ERP MCP server bounds the view model by roles, duties, and privileges. That is necessary. It is not sufficient. The snapshot contains everything the user could see and click on that surface at that moment: fields, labels, enabled, disabled states, and command metadata. The agent reasons over that snapshot. If a button is enabled for a role but only ever used after a human checks 3 downstream screens, the agent will not respect that unwritten ceremony. If the affordance is present, it's in play. Tighten view models by disabling actions you don't want composed and by scoping MCP to the minimum set of forms your scenario requires. Tool semantics matter. The 20 tools are primitives: open list, filter, select, read field, click command, execute operation. They're generic on purpose so they survive UI change. Your safe pattern is to constrain the catalog by scenario, not by hope. Build allow lists of tools per agent and per flow. For example, an assess credit agent doesn't need create vendor, modify bank account, or post journal in its tool map. Default deny in Copilot Studio is possible if you choose to act like an engineer instead of a maker. Attach reviews to tool map changes. Treat adding one more tool as a code diff with tests. Plan for server-side computer use. There is no client session to watch. The orchestration consumes server-rendered view models and issues tool calls. That's good for reliability. It's bad for observability if you stay at the old audit layer. Capture the MCP dialog, view model requests, tool invocations, parameters, return codes, and the orchestration's branch decisions. If you don't have a place for those logs, create one now. After an incident, the delta between we executed these 5 tools and we considered these 9 and pruned 4 is the difference between storytelling and causality. Pin your identities. You will need 4 classes: the human, the agent's identity in Copilot Studio, per connector service principles for Power Automate and Graph, and the ERP MCP server's app registration. Do not use my connection in flows. Issue single-purpose least scope service principles per connector per flow. Force explicit runners disclosure on sensitive actions and propagate the Entra object IDs through correlation IDs into outcome records. When you do your composite pathway review, you want a clean chain: user, Copilot Studio agent ID, ERP MCP app ID, Automate Flow app IDs, Graph Outlook Teams app IDs. If you can't draw it on one line, you won't be able to contain it in one call. Model selection is not trivia. Reasoning models behave differently. Microsoft's guidance will change, your obligation will not. For regulated flows, pin the model snapshot and record the hash with the outcome and the decision trace. Maintain a compatibility matrix for model, prompt, tool map, regression test them together. A benign upgrade in the planner can alter tie-break behavior, turn recent payments into a stronger signal than aging distribution, or change how the agent handles timeouts. If you don't have a gate that runs seeded specimens and checks variance bands, you will learn about posture changes through production drift. Grounding sources are part of your attack surface. The temptation is to add just one more enrichment feed. Every new source is another domain of missingness penalties and data sparsity the planner will treat as neutral. Document your ranking. For example, internal disputes, statements, correspondent emails, enrichment feed X. Put that ranking under change control. When someone reorders sources, require a test that shows narrative polarity didn't flip for your seeded specimens. Snapshots and state deserve attention. View models reflect the server's state now. Long-running plans may re-request the snapshot and see new evidence that a human wouldn't have checked again. That adaptivity can be useful. It can also produce race conditions where plan step 3 relies on a field that changed between step 1 and 3. If your scenario is sensitive to that, constrain the plan to a bounded window or require step up if the view model changed in a material way between reads. You can't freeze the ERP, you can engineer around change. Integrate continuous access evaluation into action, not just sign in. If device posture or risk levels degrade during a session, block sensitive tool invocations mid-plan. This is where conditional access can still matter if you move it from session start to action time. Wire the check into the orchestration edge. Don't hope the plan finishes before posture changes. Treat BPA carefully. The analytics MCP server is powerful and tempting. It can answer what is the monthly trend quickly. It cannot explain line-level exceptions. If you let the planner lean on BPA aggregates for case-level decisions without exposing per-record evidence, you are building narratives out of statistics. Force the planner to fetch line-level data for decisions that affect dollars and use BPA as context, not authority. Evaluate retries and backoffs. Tool calls will fail transiently. The planner will retry or select a fallback. Write policy for retries. How many, over what window, and when to escalate. Log the backoffs. A surprising amount of drift is simply timeout handling changing the evidence order. If you don't log the delays, you'll misdiagnose posture as policy. Decide how you'll handle unknowns. Missing data cannot be neutral in policy-critical dimensions. For ESG and procurement, unknown must be penalized explicitly. For fraud in service refunds, manual review should be a hard constraint on action, not a soft signal to add goodwill. Encode these as guardrails at the orchestration edge. If you leave it to the planner, it will treat unknown as low friction and push toward convenience. Finally, build your engineering ergonomics now. Provide SDK-like wrappers that enforce decision trace emission, correlation ID propagation, step-up prompts for sensitive tools, and regression test hooks for prompt and grounding changes. Give makers paved roads that make the safe thing the easy thing. If your environment rewards the quick demo over the audited pathway, you'll get acceleration with erosion by design. If you wire these mechanics early, you can keep the power of MCP and Copilot while containing the blast radius and preserving causality. If you don't, you'll be the person in the room explaining why everything was technically within scope while the meaning of your controls quietly dissolved. Reliability and evaluation patterns. Most teams ask, is it accurate? And stop there. Reliability for agentic systems isn't a single metric. It's a portfolio. Evaluate like an SRE with a regulator looking over your shoulder. The categories are consistent. Accuracy and groundedness, reliability under stress, safety and compliance, and ROI tied to a real business denominator. If you can't score each with artifacts you retain, you're grading vibes. Start with accuracy and groundedness. The simple version is, does the output match a gold label? The grown-up version is, does the recommendation trace back to authorized sources and reproduce within a tolerance band? Build a seeded corpus of specimens per domain, 10 to 20 invoice, credit, procurement, and service cases with frozen inputs and expected outcomes. For each, define acceptable variance bands. Identical may be impossible. Same decision class with rationale referencing these fields is realistic. Require source citations to point to actual tables and fields, not just a general based on account history. If an answer can't show its grounding, it isn't accurate in a way you can defend. Reliability is not best effort sunshine. It's how the system behaves when the world is noisy. Test retries and backoffs by injecting latency and timeouts into downstream connectors. Does evidence order change? Do recommendations flip more often than your policy tolerates? Add input fuzzing, missing fields, malformed attachments, OCR noise to ensure posture aligns with policy. Low confidence should increase scrutiny, not lenience. Measure tail behavior, mean time between assist unavailable, mean time to recovery, and percentage of actions aborted versus escalated when guardrails trip. These are SLOs for the planner, not just the API. Safety and compliance are not a separate spreadsheet. They are visible behaviors at the orchestration edge. Build red team scenarios for synthesis DLP. Combine benign attributes into sensitive outputs and see if your gates catch them at egress. Probe SOD by attempting observe, recommend, execute with one identity and confirm step-up fires. Try privilege creep by modifying tool maps and connector scopes. Your evaluation harness should detect new capabilities before production does. Test CA at action time by changing device or risk posture mid-plan and confirm sensitive invocations block. These tests are your canaries. Run them weekly. Groundedness needs its own harness. Retrieval isn't free of failure modes. Evaluate hallucination rates not as percentage of false sentences, but as percentage of recommendations with unverifiable claims given the trace. Require the agent to list the fields and records that drove the decision. Verify they exist in the snapshot. Score unsupported assertions per 100 decisions and set a budget. If your number drifts upward, pause changes at the compiler. Business value sits alongside reliability, not in a different meeting. Define ROI metrics that blend throughput with explainability and containment, time to resolution, time to explain, variance bands, step-up rates, and rework cost per decision. A shorter average handle time with a 3x increase in time to explain is a bad trade for regulated workflows. Track assist acceptance rate with a counterpart assist rollback rate and assist-driven incident rate. If you can't correlate behavior to orchestrator changes through a change log, you're running an untestable system no matter how good your medians look. Observability is the substrate. You cannot evaluate what you do not see. Instrument the orchestration dialog, model snapshot IDs, prompt and tool map hashes, inputs ingested, feature influences, even if coarse, tool sequence, branches pruned, retrees executed, step-up prompts shown, and human acknowledgements. Emit a correlation ID that threads through Dynamics, Automate, Graph, Outlook, and Teams. Put this on a separate, queryable plane before your first pilot. Your evaluation harness should consume traces like logs, not screenshots. Non-determinism isn't an excuse, it's a constraint you design around. Adopt tolerance-based regression. For your seeded corpus, define decision class equivalents. Approve, hold, investigate, narrative invariance, fields that must be cited, and numerical tolerance bands for thresholds. Pin model and prompt snapshots for regulated flows and only advance with a passing gate. When you do advance, run A/B evaluation, measure shifts in acceptance, step-ups, and concession ladders across live traffic samples. Alert on polarity shifts, meaningful changes in recommend rates or refund amounts tied to orchestrator changelog entries. Finally, package evaluation like an operator, not a marketer. Maintain a living scorecard with 4 sections: reliability SLOs, availability of assist, escalation rate, retry behavior, accuracy and groundedness, decision class match rate, unsupported assertion budget, safety and compliance, SOD violation attempts blocked, synthesis DLP catches, CA action time blocks, and business impact, time to resolution, time to explain, incident mean time to contain. Tie deltas to explicit changes in prompts, tool maps, model snapshots, and connector scopes. Publish it monthly to control owners. If your evaluation runs only at launch, you don't have reliability, you have a demo. The counterintuitive part is simple. You don't make probabilistic systems deterministic enough. You make their envelopes crisply testable. Then you pin what must not drift, observe what will, and gate the compiler where meaning meets acceleration.